Hello and good evening all. While we're awaiting data recovery of my photo hard drives, we're going to do a few more compilation or listy videos, mostly looking at cars I'm unlikely to ever see on track, and thus will never have the opportunity to photograph properly, thus throwing the original ethical code of the channel completely out the window. Now, obviously the category cars I'm unlikely to ever see on track is a bit overly broad and ill-defined to use as the sole criteria for a video, or even a video series, so each video, as with the channel's theme weeks, will have a single, unifying, more specific theme that's generally easier for everybody else to follow, although most of these categories will still be pretty broad. So for our first video in the series 5 Cars That, let's take a look at 5 race cars that never got off the ground, that is to say, that never got to turn a wheel in anger. Let's start with the Peugeot 908 Hybrid 4. As a brief addendum, the cars in these videos aren't ranked in any particular order of excellence or interest unless otherwise noted. Additionally, I'll be releasing each section in this video as its own standalone video, mostly to gauge which generates the most interest, at which point I'll do a deeper dive video on that car as a follow-up. Or, if you don't feel like watching each of those individually and you'd like to cast a vote on this video instead, go ahead and do so in the comments. Sidebar over. The early 2010s were not a great time for automakers when it came to economic stability. As caches crunched and belts were tightened, the bean counters in their shiny offices frequently considered expensive racing programs to be some of those proverbial low-hanging fruit that accountants are always seeking to pluck for their own aggrandizement. Into this period came Peugeot, along with all the other automakers because that's how linear time works, but unlike most of the other manufacturers of four-wheeled things, Peugeot was several years and several $100 million into a battle with Audi for dominance on the world's endurance race circuits. Also, unlike most of the other manufacturers who had attempted to stand up to Ingolstadt since their first Le Mans victory in 2000, Peugeot had managed to achieve some substantial success against the four-ringed juggernaut, and in 2011 they brought out an updated version of their 908 HDI FAP LMP1, or word salad, simply called the 908. Following the testing of a 908 HDI retrofitted with hybrid components as a technology demonstrator at Silverstone in 2008, the upcoming replacement car was designed to potentially integrate a hybrid system as it was developed. The car was originally, however, built as a non-hybrid, and went racing in 2011 in that guise, proving strong on pace and looking like the stage remained set for close battles between the 908 and the new closed-cockpit Audi, the R18. For 2012, then, a hybrid version was planned to compete with Audi's upcoming e-tron Quattro version of the R18. Testing was actually run concurrent with the 2011 season in many ways, so that transition had always been on the cards, but either way, their primary challenges in adding the hybrid components reportedly came mostly from issues with cooling. That being said, the components for the original version of the car had all been designed with additional hybrid gubbins in mind, and were thus able to be retained for the new vehicle, encompassing an in-house built carbon fiber monocoque and body panels, double wishbone and pushrod actuated torsion bar suspension on all 4 wheels, Michelin tires, a 3.0, actually since it's French, Michelin tires, a 3.7-liter twin-turbo diesel V8 mated to a Ricardo-sourced 6-speed sequential manual transmission with a limited slip differential. This power plant was good for 550 horsepower by itself, and the entire package was sufficiently feathery to require ballasting to hit the 900-kilogram LMP1 weight limit. Adding the hybrid system, which consisted of lithium-ion batteries for energy storage, in contrast to the flywheel system to be employed by Audi or Toyota's supercapacitors, an inverter, and a motor generator unit that also allowed the removal of a starter and alternator. So the net weight gain for adding the hybrid system was only about 40 kilos, which left the new 908 still 30 kgs underweight of the class minimum. The hybrid system was capable of sending an additional 80 horsepower to the rear wheels, a different setup than those pursued by other manufacturers developing their hybrid systems, all of whom opted to use the hybrid as a semi-four-wheel drive system and send the power from the batteries or supercapacitors or flywheel to the front wheels. It was also capable of running entirely under electric power, which it used to run on pit lane. There were several other innovations that Peugeot was in the process of trialing during the development, including attempts at integrating the majority of the hybrid components into the bell housing of the transmission, which was moderately successful at first, and at water cooling the batteries, which perhaps unsurprisingly was less successful, given the general result when one introduces water to high-voltage electricity. And the third and final iteration of the battery system was thus oil-cooled. The batteries were moved to the tub to improve reliability in the final design, and the remaining focus pivoted back to cooling, particularly focused on the energy recovery systems that worked with the brakes and the duty cycle of the battery, increasing the latter of which meant driving the former to temperatures that could not be sustained over the length of a stint, much less an entire race. And this was primarily limited by the airflow permitted within the aerodynamic regulations. I do realize I'm stringing together quite a few very not simple sentences there. I apologize. But I'm not sorry enough to go back and fix it. The Peugeot team, then, in preparation for the 2012 season, loaded up several cars, possibly including one or more of the new hybrids, and shipped off to Sebring for pre-season testing. Shortly after their arrival, and with team personnel still en route from points abroad, Peugeot announced sweeping austerity measures to try and right-size their balance sheet to the tune of €800 million and 6,000 employees. And the 50 million or so that was sailing out the door every year on a cloud of sweet-smelling Total Excellium diesel was unfortunately on the chopping block. The 908s were shipped back to France, and a 908 Hybrid 4 never made its Le Mans debut, nor turned a single lap in anger. Okay, let's hop back 45 years and cross the channel to look at one of my favorite Jag designs, what I would argue might be Malcolm Sayers' best design work, the XJ13. Jag in the early 60s was what might be called an organization of considerable self-worth in the motoring world, particularly in racing, and not without justification. The D-Type had won Le Mans in 1955, 1956, and 1957, until it was subsequently rendered obsolete due to regulation changes, largely aimed at the car, and thus Jag was eyeing a return to La Sarthe with some not inconsiderable interest in the new decade. They were flush with cash, at least as far as Jag's fortunes go, from the success of the E-Type after its launch in 1961, and with the relaxing of Le Mans displacement restrictions again, Jag's engineering director, William Hines, not sure, motivated the final development of a dual overhead camshaft V12 that had been bouncing around drawing boards at the firm for some time. This engine essentially consisted of two XK straight sixes splodged together to share a common crankshaft, just like two shortbread biscuits are splodged together with some jam to make a jammy dodger. The engine was almost entirely made from aluminium, as befits a racing engine, initially equipped with 6 carburetors that were later replaced with Lucas fuel injection. And there were several minor internal modifications from the XK engine to optimize the new power plant for racing. It took until 1964 before the initial development of the 5-liter 12-cylinder was complete, this development led by a Claude Bailey, and the rest of the car was designed around it and a ZF 5-speed manual gearbox, the combination of which sent power, unsurprisingly, to the rear wheels, either 502 or 445 horsepower, depending on which source you prefer, and about 380 pound-feet of torque. It was a relatively short trip, too, for that power, as Jag designed the XJ13 with the latest innovative concepts popular in the field of the time, and thus, like its contemporaries, the Lotus 25 and the Lola Mark VI, also conveniently designed not that far away in other parts of England land, the engine was mid-mounted, the chassis was an aluminium-based monocoque, and the drivetrain was a fully stressed member of the chassis. Quite a potentially compelling setup, as we saw with the Lola T70 in its various versions. Malcolm Sayer penned a stunningly beautiful riveted aluminium roadster body. Suspension was more double wishbones this time with coil springs. Stopping power came from ventilated Gearling disc brakes, and the total weight for the car came in at just under 1,000 kilos, or 2,200 pounds, with a reported top speed of 278 kilometers an hour or 178 miles per hour. However, by the time all the major development work had been completed and the first chassis constructed in 1966, circumstances had changed. Jag had been purchased by BMC, the British Motor Company, and focus had shifted to developing the new XJ Saloon, which, okay, fair, that's the sort of thing that actually potentially turns a profit. The competition landscape had changed as well, however. Ford had finally won at Le Mans with the 7-liter GT40 Mark II, prompting the Frenchies to change the rules again and and announce a production requirement for any cars with engines larger than 3 liters, which effectively rendered the XJ13 obsolete with its 5-liter V12 and production volume of 1. The production requirement, for those of you unaware, was of course 50 in those days, and while Ford had the economic might to kind of push that through, and I don't know, Ferrari glad-handed somebody to get an exception made, Jag wasn't quite that well off even with BMC behind them. Further testing of the 1 XJ13 at several UK racetracks revealed that substantial further development would be required to make the car competitive on pace with the current Fords and Ferraris, never mind the production requirements, and as such the car was relegated to a storage shed for several years. It was then briefly revived for a commercial to advertise the upcoming Series 3 E-Type, which was going to be sold with Jag's first production V12, only to experience a blowout on the host track's banking, causing the car to crash and sustain heavy damage, after which it was restored unrestored. Abbey Panels Limited, the company responsible for much of the original metalwork for Jag's competition machinery in that era, as well as the original GT40, a few Lotuses, a few MGs, and a raft of others besides, offered to rebuild the car for Jag, and it was repaired with some slight bodywork modifications, and went on to be shown for several years by the Marks Heritage Department until the healthier of its 2 engines was over-revved and thus destroyed. This relegated the car to use only with the second power plant, which was only marginally healthier than the first one after its over-revving. A complete restoration was undertaken in the early 2000s, with the car finally making a re-debut appearance at the 2007 Le Mans Classic and Goodwood Festival of Speed. It now lives in the British Motor Museum in Gaydon, and hopefully receives regular exercise, although I don't know for certain. Continuing with the 1960s theme, but now over in the US, we're going to look at another GT40 contender that wasn't. Chevrolet's CERV II, or I'm going to call it the CERV II for the rest of the video, even if it was never actually called that, because it's much easier. For most of the middle part of the 20th century, Chevrolet was rather reticent about funding any official racing efforts, apparently due in part to pressure from the federal government, apart from the flashes in the pan that were the lovely Corvette SS and the more successful successor, the still relatively low-profile Stingray racing car designed by Bill Mitchell. They then pivoted to providing tacit and sometimes rather substantial supports to outfits like McLaren and Chaparral, and as such, Chevrolet never pursued an all-out international race program, like Ford were doing with the GT40, following their initial plans for the SS. There was also something to do with the American Auto Manufacturers Union agreement through most of the 50s and early 60s, but be that as it may, they did take another half-hearted back-office stab at it in the early to mid-1960s with this car, the CERV II. CERV, or CERV, stands for Chevrolet Engineering Research Vehicle, and these cars were the brainchild of one Zora Arkus-Duntov, an engineer and racing driver with 2 class wins at Le Mans to his name, and sufficient input on the design of the Corvette to have earned the moniker the father of the Corvette. The first CERV was an open-wheel mid-engine testbed for ride and handling studies under a variety of conditions, while the second design, the one with which we are concerned this evening, on the other hand, was intended to return Chevrolet to competition where the SS had left off, aimed squarely at several miles of highway in the French countryside by way of Sebring, Florida. Following from the CERV I, design work on the new car started in late 1961 as the GS2 or GS3, GS standing for Grand Sport. Like its predecessor, it was also mid-engined, and depending on how prescriptive one is, could be considered the genesis of the mid-engined Corvette legend, aimed at taking advantage of the aerodynamic efficiencies that could be realized with such a design. The car also carried over the all-aluminum V8. Yes, we're calling it aluminum because we're on the American side of the ocean, rather than aluminium, which is what we call it when we talk about British cars. Initially expanded to 6.2 liters, or 377 cubic inches, with a single overhead camshaft and Hilborn fuel injection, which provided about 500 horsepower. Mr. Arkus Duntov wanted to send power to all four wheels, which was bold at the time, allegedly drawing inspiration from the even bolder and more pioneering Bugatti T53 from 1932, but in this case it was going through a Powerglide torque converter and two of General Motors' two-speed clutchless manual transmissions. Brief post-editing interjection here that they are clutchless automatics. My apologies. One for each axle. There may have been a torque converter for each axle as well. It's not entirely clear in the sources I used. A similar setup would, actually, if memory serves, also see use on the Chaparral 2A, admittedly just sending power to the rear wheels through one transmission in that application, but we'll talk more about Chaparral in a minute. As a potential alternative development path should the all-wheel drive approach not work out, a rear-wheel drive version was planned as well, this being labeled the GS2, while the all-wheel drive car was the GS3. A fiberglass roadster body designed by Larry Shinoda and Anatoly Lapin, who would later add the Porsche 924 and 928 to his resume, was draped over the aluminum and steel monocoque and brought total weight to only 1,848 pounds or 838 kilos, with a coupe body intended for the planned 6-car production run. 3 cars would be built to be competition machinery, with the other 3 serving as testing mules and parts cars as needed. The first car was ready in 1964, reportedly surpassing the 210-mile-an-hour mark while testing at Milford Proving Grounds, and Sterling Moss and once-and-future President Dan Gurney had the honor of running demonstration laps during that year's U.S. Grand Prix at Riverside. However, hopes for tacit approval from the GM executives, or at least the turning of a blind eye to the fact that Mr. Duntov was only in the loosest senses of the term following the rules of GM not being involved in any racing activities, as he intended to sell the GS cars to private individuals and also pretty much give them a key to the spare parts barn. This proved in vain. Before the end of the year, the naughty stick had been brought out from its baize bag, and it was lashings fore and aft for the Corvettesters, with Arkus Duntov told in no uncertain terms that he was not going to race today, that he wasn't indeed the fiberglass messiah.
He's a very naughty boy!
Actually, given that this was not the first time that Mr. Arkus Duntov had been slapped on the wrist for trying to build Chevrolet race cars in circumvention of the AMA ban on manufacturer involvement in racing, and the later federal intervention even more strictly forbidding General Motors from it in particular under pain of being broken up as a monopoly, I wouldn't be that surprised that the GM execs came into the shop one day to find him working away on another race car and basically reenacted this scene from Casablanca.
How can you close me up? On what ground?
Nevertheless, now that Arkus Duntov had been told no a bit more directly than even he could try to beg off of, he kept the one GS3 that had been built, changed its designation to CERV II, which is what we now know it as, and repurposed it as a test car for developing Corvettes of the future, putting in another 6 years of service, providing real-world data on everything from aerodynamic designs to tire compounds to experimental engines. At one point, it was reportedly fitted with a chain-driven V8, before being fitted with a larger
7-liter V8 motor,
dubbed the ZL1, which made almost 550 horsepower and torques, and improved the 0 to 60 time to a reported 2.5 seconds, which, for those of you keeping score at home, is more comparable to the Bugatti Veyrons rather than the Bugatti T53s. Anyway, the order from on high was officially the end of the line for the GS3/CERV II's potential as a racing vehicle, but the advanced design principles previewed by the car seemed to generate incredibly spontaneously over in Jim Hall's neck of the woods with his new Chaparral 2 model, which shockingly sported the aforementioned Chevrolet V8 plus Powerglide torque converter and 2-speed clutchless manual. Automatic, just like the CERV. Oh, did I mention that Jim Hall put in some testing miles of the car at some point as well? Once again, I'm shocked to find racing development going on in this establishment. Actually, this tech transfer apparently came from a different design group within General Motors, Frank Winchell's group, but either way, it's two sides of the same coin. And the CERV II was put back in storage until it was donated to the Briggs Cunningham Museum in, I think, the 1970s, subsequently changing hands several times until 2013, when it was sold at auction for $1.1 million, and I'm not sure if it's been seen again since. For number 4 on our list, I originally wanted to talk about the Toyota T6 prototype, but information on the car, if it ever even really existed beyond a static mock-up, is so scanty that I couldn't in good conscience include it without further research. So, if anyone has any recommendations for where more information on this particular car shown, or the closed cockpit version of the T7, of which one or the other quite possibly caused the death of Sashio Fukuzawa, please let me know in the comments so I can delve deeper. Otherwise, I'll continue web trawling as the time permits, because I don't think my local library has a whole lot of peerless reference works about Group 6 concepts from Japan from the 1960s. Instead, we're going to move a bit closer to the present and look at a what might have been, had Monsieur Jean Rondeau pursued his initial concept for an outright attempt at Le Mans victory, instead of the more conventional design that became the M579 and granted him his dark horse win at La Sarthe in 1980. Initially, following his class win in 1977 with his Inaltera GTP, Rondeau started working on a concept for a far more radical machine to take the fight to Porsche and Mirage in 1979. Taking inspiration from the Tyrrell P34 that had been moderately successful in the 1976 Formula One season, Monsieur Jean expressed the opinion that it would have been even more capable had it received better tires, and set out to design a comparable sports car along similar lines. He was quoted in an interview about the benefits of such a project in sports car racing, stating, "I won't do a silly French accent for this, but I will for the short video just about this one. It will weigh around 700 kilos. A six-wheeler is much more advantageous on fast circuits. When braking, the gain is around 30%. Le Mans is precisely a fast circuit, so imagine this repeated gain over 400 laps. On the other hand, in terms of handling, a six-wheeler is significantly superior. As it rains very often at Le Mans, it is no exaggeration to think it will take place entirely in the rain in the near future. Again, we would have the advantage." End quote. Which all sounds good in principle, but such a radical design would command quite a substantial investment, as it would be essentially ground up rather than a rehash of his previous vehicles. The new body design did away with the coupe styling of the Inaltera GTP, instead smacking of a bit of a mix between the Porsche 936 with that big air intake over the driver's head, while retaining the lateral finned but spoilerless rear that he had trialed on the Inaltera and essentially retained on his cars until the Le Mans victory in 1980. There is, at least in my opinion, something of the realized Rondeaus in the air intakes as well, but the mock-up also had partially fared-in rear wheels, which any longtime viewer of the channel will know is one of my favorite design elements on a prototype. It's actually got a bit of a speed racer look going on in the rear too, with those almost nacelle-looking rear quarter things. He also intended to replace the 3-liter naturally aspirated Ford Cosworth DFV powerplant with a smaller, turbocharged 2.1-liter DFX model that nonetheless made more power, anywhere from 520 to 630, depending on settings, versus the Inaltera's 415. And he intended to use a riveted aluminum monocoque with fiberglass and Kevlar bodywork. All pretty standard for the time. Initial testing calculated a drag coefficient of 0.30, worse than one might expect, but I think exacerbated greatly by the windshield height regulations that would be in place for 1979, which we can see in the model, which is also when the car was intended to debut. A Hewland 5-speed gearbox was intended to send power to the rear wheels, carried over from the Inaltera, and weight was expected to actually be lower than the Inaltera GTP at only 700 kilos. Suspension would have been double wishbones at the front and parallel arms with trailing upper links at the rear, while the tire supplier remained unspecified, although Rondeau did confirm in an interview that he had one lined up after his analysis that the Tyrrell was really rather let down by the fact that it didn't have a cooperative tire supplier. Funding was supposed to be coming from several sources, including the government of Haiti, of all places, to cover the anticipated 20 million franc budget that the project would require. But regulation changes that came out relatively simultaneously with the debut of the technical specifications and the scale model of the 579, which is what we've been looking at, meant that if funding had been secured and the project moved forward, it would have been able to contest at best a single season before six-wheeled vehicles were outlawed at Le Mans as well, and thus the project died before it could come to life. Now, there are some arguments to be made, not without merit, that the M579 was never more than a paper tiger intended to raise eyebrows and sponsorship interest. I'd actually even consider that to be a generally reasonable set of arguments, as the writing was already on the wall for the design trend, and Rondeau was known to be struggling to attract sponsors for his racing efforts following the departure of Inaltera. Even without the rule changes that rendered the design ineligible for competition, I would be surprised if it had been able to make it all the way to competition, just by virtue of how gosh darn difficult it is to bring a radical new design to reality, especially without the enormous financial resources of a major manufacturer. But it would have been fantastic if it had come to pass, and if anyone could have done it on a shoestring, I think it would have been Monsieur Rondeau. And for our fifth and final car, almost. It's another car that was shrouded in rumor and mystery for far longer than it was ever in development. It's Porsche's Le Mans prototype for the new millennium, the LMP2000, or, if you prefer the internal designation, the 9R3. It's not a very good name, is it? I mean, LMP2000 sounds pretty good, but 9R3 sounds a bit dull. There are a few disparate components that contribute to the LMP2000 story, as the car was in some ways a bit of a hodgepodge rather than a nice, smooth, linear start-to-end project. The oldest component for the car was actually its engine, based on a 1993 design for the Footwork Formula One team. The design, a 3.5-liter V10, had been rather unsuccessful to say the least, with the team canning the contract with Porsche halfway through the season after numerous issues with the engine, but Porsche continued to fiddle with the design as a side project after the fact, before putting it on a shelf for the rest of the decade. The chassis, on the other hand, was started later but largely finished earlier. Porsche acknowledged that their victory with the Dower 962 in 1994 had been something of a lucky win from a regulations standpoint, one that would not be easily repeatable, and they retained Wiet Huidekoper following that victory to assist in the development of the upcoming GT1 alongside long-standing Porsche veteran designer and engineer Norbert Singer. With Huidekoper, which is fun to say, but I am sure I'm saying it wrong, promoted to lead the Motorsports Design Bureau in 1997, work then commenced on a replacement for the GT1 as well, since that loophole, too, had something of an obvious expiration date, with the future clearly to be found in a true, purpose-built Le Mans prototype that actually complied with that rule set, rather than the definitely not a prototype gov that the GT1 was. Huidekoper and Singer continued their collaboration, with the former focused on mechanical design and production, while Singer did aero and performance for the new LMP, originally intended for debut in 1999. Most of the initial design and testing was done with CAD software, something that had only really found favor at Porsche by Huidekopper's insistence, although scale models were constructed for wind tunnel testing. The chassis and bodywork were designed internally and then sent to Lola Composites for construction out of carbon fiber, and componentry was carried over with modifications, or reused outright, from the outgoing GT1 wherever possible, including the suspension design and flat-six engine.
But then we hit a roadblock. The great library of Alexandria in Egypt is burned,
revealing that the 911-derived flat-sixes that had been Porsche's competition backbone for the past 20 years was really at the end of its useful competition life in its current format, at least for prototype racing, as it was, just too heavy and underpowered. I mean, they'd only been using it since the early 70s, so, no, late 70s? Mid-70s? Somewhere in the 70s. So, 20 years out of any engine is excellent. However, convincing Porsche of this was, perhaps unsurprisingly difficult. They're not really good at doing change. It wasn't until Huidekopper started making comparisons to their potential Le Mans competitors that the Porsche executives came to their senses and cancelled the LMP 1999 project. Several months later, however, Huidekopper was back at Weissach and asked his opinion on the suitability of the old Formula One power plant for endurance applications. This much newer and shinier engine was decidedly a better choice, and the project resumed with a new target debut of the Space Year 2000. The 1999 carbon fiber chassis was largely retained as originally designed, though now the V10 served as a fully stressed member, a feature of which the Boxer 6 would have been incapable, mated to a 6-speed sequential manual transmission, and the engine had been modified to enhance its reliability, including an increase in displacement to between 5 and 5.5 liters, pending final engineering decisions. And then, unfortunately, the corporate decision was made to cancel the project yet again, this time not for engineering reasons, but rather for, never clearly elocuted, probably political ones. Porsche was inching ever closer to its current bizarre ownership and subsidiary ship of Volkswagen Gruppe. To the keyboard warriors, yes, I do actually understand the nature of the relationship, but this isn't the appropriate venue for that messy web of ownership and subordinateship. And they were in the process of trying to ride along in the development of the Volkswagen Touareg and Audi Q7 in pursuit of the vehicle that would yield Porsche's financial salvation, the Cayenne. But VW was taking their first stab at Le Mans that year with the R8R and R8C, and planning a more concerted effort for the new millennium based on their learnings from the two 1999 attempts. Competition from the winningest Le Mans manufacturer of all time would hardly make their job easier, and so allegedly a deal was reached between Ferdinand Piëch of Volkswagen Gruppe, then formerly of Porsche, and Wendelin Wiedeken, to cooperate on the big SUV project in exchange for Porsche pumping the brakes on any Le Mans prototype work for a decade, including the LMP2000. 2 chassis had been completed at that point, with one well progressed towards full assembly, and the Porsche board did allow funds sufficient for that one car to be completed. Presumably the second chassis was destroyed, after which it had a single testing weekend at Weissach under the helmsmanship of the now late great Bob Wallach and the Flying Scotsman Alan McNish. Both reported favorably on the car's potential, but of course that didn't make much odds compared to the will of the board, and so the one completed car was straight back into the storage shed, with all those involved actually ordered to deny the car ever existed for well over a decade. The engine did get a second, or perhaps more appropriately third and fourth lease on life in the Carrera GT road car, pretty much as designed for the LMP2000, and in the RS Spider LMP2, less 2 cylinders. Actually, that would also give it a fifth lease on life in the current 963, but it wasn't until 2018 that the car was first revealed to the public at the Goodwood Festival of Speed, after which it underwent further restoration and ran in October of last year, 2024, still driven by Alan McNish. Had the project gone ahead as built in 2000, no doubt the first decade of the new millennia would have been much more interesting at Le Mans. Actually, It's possible, and I'm going to engage in an extreme hypothetical with a lot of, butterfly effects here, that having a consistent competitor like Porsche may actually have extended the lifespan of the R8 simply because it wouldn't have been quite so dominant, and thus the regulatory bodies wouldn't have tried to hobble it into obsolescence in the way that it historically did. Alternately, the R10 may have come out earlier, but still have been powered with a petrol-powered engine rather than going for diesel. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for our final honorable mention, I want to make a brief post-recording update, not very brief, honorable mention for the Ford J-Car, given both its non-participation in any major endurance race and its contributions to the overarching GT40 program. The original designs for the GT40 had, well, some flaws. The vehicle, with its steel monocoque, was too heavy, and the V8 somewhat underpowered to truly be in contention for a win at Le Mans. And while Carroll Shelby was working on developing the Mark II version of the car, in 1965, Ford also started to examine a more radical departure from the original design, focused primarily on taking some of Mr. Eric Broadley's suggestions that had resulted in his departure from the project in the first place. Some lessons were also taken from the X1 Roadster that had been initially developed by McLaren and further refined by Shelby to take outright victory at Sebring in '66, but design elements were also borrowed from more exotic sources like the aerospace industry. The new chassis for this experimental car was an aluminum honeycomb produced by Brunswick Aerospace, similar in geometry to the preceding GT40 tubs, but with a narrower cockpit design permitted based on Appendix J in the FIA regulations, which also lent the car its most well-known moniker, the J-Car, although the internal designation was Ford GTP, or GT Prototype. This was just one of the many changes in the overall fiberglass bodywork from the earlier cars. It emphasized low drag over all other points, sporting a flat bread van-esque roof, ending in a sharp cut-off rear, not dissimilar to the one-off Ferrari Drogo and the not-yet-developed Lola T70 Mark III, while the front fascia was initially a pretty angular, almost insectoid design that I quite like. This redesign did come with a significant weight savings, dropping the total weight to somewhere between 1,207 kilos and 900. Reports vary, and I do acknowledge that that's a big gap. It was still a bruiser compared to the Ferraris with whom Ford was competing. For reference, the 330 P2 was 820 kilos, or 1,810 pounds, and the P3 was 851 kgs. But this did represent a savings of at least 300 pounds, or 136 kilos, from the Mark II, so not insignificant by any means. I have just realized that perhaps the J-Car weighed 900 kgs, and the Mark II was the one that weighed 1,200. That could be it. Moving on. The reuse of much of the tub geometry did mean that the mechanicals from the Mark II could be retained, including the suspension, improved brakes, and Galaxy-derived big block
7-liter V8 motor.
The tubs were built by the Ford-owned Carcraft shop, car and craft both being spelled with K's for some reason, who also designed a 2-speed automatic gearbox for the car, perhaps taking some inspiration either from the CERV II or more likely from the Chaparral 2A that had bested them at Sebring that year, 1965, and assembly was completed back home in Dearborn. The first car was ready for the Le Mans test day in April of 1966, with Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon splitting driving duties in the rainy conditions. The J-Car did post the fastest time of the weekend, but Ford refrained from entering the car in the race itself, preferring instead the more mature Mark II platform to pursue outright victory at Les Arth. This did turn out to be the correct choice, but be that as it may. The J-Car was shipped back stateside. A second car was completed about the same time to increase the cadence of the testing campaign, with the first car dedicated largely to working on improving the car's high-speed stability. The second car was ostensibly intended to compete in Can-Am later that year, and testing began in earnest in August of 1966, with Ken Miles as the primary testing driver. This was, of course, what brought about the unfortunate end of Mr. Miles's life, when at the end of a full day of testing at Riverside in early August, the J-Car flipped, crashed, and essentially disintegrated into its constituent components, reportedly killing Mr. Miles instantly as he was ejected from the car. The cause of the crash has never been fully determined, or at least never been disclosed by Ford, but it is highly unlikely that it was as a result of driver error. In addition to his not inconsiderable raw talent, Miles arguably had more experience driving the various iterations of the GT40 than anyone else, having been Mr. Shelby's lead test driver since 1963, and thus it's all but unthinkable that he had simply made a grievous error in his driving. In addition to being a tragic death, the mechanisms of the loss meant that conducting a point-of-failure analysis on the wrecked car was all but impossible, and the post-accident review and eventual redesign meant that the car was fundamentally changed through iteration after iteration intended to make the car safer and more robust. The car eventually reemerged as the GT Mark IV and bore little resemblance to the J car, save the narrower cabin. Of course, this turned out to be another positive, and the car won its debut outing at Sebring in 1967, gathered lots and lots of data at the Le Mans test weekend, and a veritable phalanx of 4 Mark IVs and 3 Mark IIs showed up in France to aim for a repeat victory. But that, too, of course, is a story for a different time. Also, a quick note for the pedantic numpties amongst you, I really don't place stock in the whole, the J car or the Mark IV is in GT40 argument, because it's entirely a semantic one. If we were looking at various related species of bird, nobody would have any issue with calling finches finches, even if one had a common name like the plumed twit or something, because they are taxonomically related. Thus, in the same way, the Mark II and J car and Mark IV are all ontologically GT40s by virtue of their engineering principles, and Ford at one point even called them GT40s, at least according to this letter dated February 1968, regarding both a Mark II and Mark IV that had been donated to Harrah's. I enjoy a touch of pedantry as much as the next chap, but only when it's actually clever or otherwise amusing, not just when it helps one make progress towards their merit badge for jackassery. Okay, rant over. Well, it's happened again. You've wasted another perfectly good 45 minutes watching Lensler. For this week's shameless plugs for other videos on the channel, we've previously covered the regular first-generation Peugeot 908 HDI, the Jag E-Type, the Lola T70, the Audi R8, GT1 as a class has been covered in the Defcon GT video, thus the Porsche 911 GT1 by Reflex. Sebring 1965 and 66 have their own videos. The 1966 video, admittedly with a few factual oversights on my part that do need correction at some point, because this is very much a learning channel. I learn as I make these videos, and so sometimes I make what seem to be blatantly obvious errors to a seasoned campaigner, but it's because I am in fact learning about some or many of these things for the first time. And I think that about covers it. There was one other, but I've forgotten what it was, and I forgot to put it in the script. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this rather different video. Hope you enjoyed it. As a reminder, each of the 6 cars mentioned in this video will also have their segment uploaded separately over the coming week for the purposes of determining which one gets a deeper dive video in future, or you can vote in the comments below. For this week's call to action not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
Never try and deep fry a snowball. With that, it just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.